registered for...
Amelia.
I guess you wouldn't be registered. Yeah. Never mind.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, you're doing that.
Elizabeth Topin. Leah Butler. Heather Cox. Ellie. Evan. Sarah Groshen. Ryan. Ryan James. Alex Johnson. Alex Johnson. Sarah Johnson. Heidi Kallenborn. Michelle Koski. Kate Lovelace. Frank Oswald. Frank. Sean Colvindale. Amanda Pomerantz. Laura Rizalti. Stephen Smar. Aaron Smith. Luke Swisher. Shelby Williamson. Madison Yoder. Megan Zeller. Aaron Bender. Sarah Moslevit. Jessica Colley. Sarah Chesnick. Chelsea Klein. Megan Core. Jonathan Corum. Dana Dochner. Daniel. Andrea Eastman. Andrea. Patrick Fisher. Alexa Gaynor. Elizabeth Jensen. Is it Erica? Erica May. Liz McMahon. Sharon Miller. Tessa Morris. Olivia Namick. Whitney Randolph. Joseph. Hannah Shook. Hannah Shook. Chelsea Simmons. Chelsea. Taylor Stone. Is it Vladimir? Vladimir?
Gone.
Vladimir.
I think he dropped.
And David Wilson. Okay, finally. Natalie Bailey. Carrie Christerson. Carrie. Megan Coggins. Bennett. No Bennett. Tyler Getz. Stephen. Katrina. Victoria. Ron. Alec. Philip. Jesse. Jesse. Alex. Elizabeth. Patrick. Celia. Taryn. Sam. Gerald. And Emily. Alright, so we're going to get started here quickly. Dr. Thompson isn't here today. I'm doing the guest lecture. We're going to move through the presentation. For the most part, what I'm going to do is try to give you all a historical context and a little bit of a timeline of each of these artists. And then we're going to move into the works themselves. Let me bring up my presentation here. And if there's anybody who came in a little bit late whose name I didn't call, make sure you hang around class after so I can make sure I get you on the roll. Okay, so the artists or the writers that we're looking at today, we're moving away from modernism and we're moving towards postmodernism. But what's really important about the four writers that we looked at and the works that we looked at is they really do show these shifts and these movements away from, but not a firm landing on a particular style or era, right? And so that's why I have this title of the lecture as From Dialogue to Disjunction, is each of these writers starts very much in a modernist school and with modernist influences, but as they move further into their career, they see, well, it's not working for me, and they try to shake that off and develop new styles, new ways of writing. Gwendolyn Brooks is the earliest. She's born in 1917. She starts writing in the 40s. So she's very much like right in the heat of modernism. But her career spans all the way up into, she dies in 2000 and she's writing all the way through. So I would say even in the 1990s. So we see a lot of changes in her work and in her style. Adrienne Rich, the same. She died earlier this year, just a couple of months ago. And she was writing the whole way through. Again, publishing as early as the 1940s. So we see, again, too, we see a lot of shifts and changes in her work. Sylvia Plath, she's pretty notorious, kind of martyred. She committed suicide in her 30s. So her career is very cut off. But we start to see very much what it is that she was working against in modernism, that one led to her, part of her personal life and her suicide, but also her work as well. In the short amount of time that she lived and wrote, we see a lot of really strong rebellions. And then Ursula K. Le Guin, she's born in 1929, but she starts writing a little bit later into the 60s, so that by the time she's very prominent and established in the 80s, we see really significant, okay, this is what postmodernism, what's included in postmodernism, and this is what we're moving away from. And we see very much the result of these changes, and essentially these rebellions and disjunctions from the modernist period. So the influences that we're going to carry through from modernism, that each of these writers does still hang on to and experiment with. And I think it's very well summed up in this Pound quote. Ezra Pound wrote, "Be influenced by as many great artists as you can, but have the decency either to acknowledge the debt outright or to try to conceal it." And a lot of these writers, because they're starting early in their career, they kind of have this ancestrage or this heritage that they take on that's very white, very male, very modern. And they're essentially, they kind of demonstrate, and each of them actually describe themselves as this, as the good girls, the A students. They were doing what they were told, especially Gwendolyn Brooks. But what they hang on to from modernism that they don't let go of, even though they do start to see it in different lights, experiment with it in different ways, is this representation of inner realities through symbolic imagery, the direct treatment of the thing or the object, which we were given in the modernist lecture from William Carlos Williams, right, with the red wheelbarrow. So this treatment of the thing or the object itself, that I can't write about death and sadness and expect that you're going to feel the same way about death or sadness that I do, right? So I have to treat the thing thing in itself. I have to give you images and a solid experience and assume, and through that we're going to share an experience. So the use of traditional forms in new and subverted ways. Traditional forms in poetry, also in other forms of literature. For instance, we've got narrative structures that we start to see kind of shaken off with Ursula K. Le Guin. So we've got form, we've got language, rhythm, rhyme, and subject matter. Using these traditional things in new ways, subverting them, making them seem, it's kind of the idea that if you can take something familiar, something that we all know, and make your reader unknow it or see it in an unfamiliar way is kind of the goal. So the Harlem Renaissance is also a big influence of modernism, essentially, that we're going to carry the changes and the perspectives and the work that we have in the Harlem Renaissance. That influence is going to carry through as well. We see in the Harlem Renaissance traditional forms, especially in poetry, traditional forms of rhyme scheme and of meter, used to express themes and scenes of African American life in the use of the Black vernacular. The language and rhythms of jazz and blues starts to be brought into poetry and into literature as well. And so that's an example of using a traditional form and somehow making it new. By drawing in these new things that don't exist in literature yet, we're making it new. Okay, so the reason that I've chosen to focus on the work that I have is, like I said, these ladies, these writers, are very much, their career span through the tumultuousness, through the change, through the movements away from, and they show these movements. And they show significant shifts in their own work, and they show significant shifts in literature as a whole. And they're doing distinctly different things, but at the same time, I feel like the way that they're engaging with what they're given, kind of a heritage or a root, they engage with it in the same ways and come out with different results, which in a sense is very distinctively postmodern. The idea that we can all be given the same plot, but we're going to construct completely different stories that contain individualities, right? And so while these women's work is distinctly unique, there are ways where it really does overlap and engage one another. And for that, I took out this excerpt. This is from an essay that Adrienne Rich wrote called Someone is Writing a Poem, and it was published in 1993, so it's very late in her writing career. But what she says about writing is that you take that material utensil language, found all about you, blank with familiarity, smeared with daily use, and make it into something that means more than it says. What poetry is made of is so old, so familiar, that it's easy to forget that it's not just the words. Every poem breaks a silence that had to be overcome. And so that's something that I want you all to keep in mind, is in what ways these writers are breaking silences. We're going to look at it for all of them. Gender is kind of is the umbrella. It's kind of the overlying silence that's being broken, but even within that, we've got Sylvia Plath, who's breaking off that 1950s housewife motif and feminine models. We've got Adrienne Rich, who spans into the women's movement, into the second wave feminist movement. We've got Gwendolyn Brooks, who takes on gender and race in very poignant ways. And she also writes, early in the 50s, she writes, she's coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. She's not part of the Harlem Renaissance, but she's following in the wake of that. And she's going to leave that behind. She's going to take up, in the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Arts Movement. And that's when we're going to see distinctive changes in her work. Ursula K. Le Guin is kind of showing where we're landing at this point. So we are going to start with Gwendolyn Brooks. And this is a little bit of a timeline of her life. So like I said, she was born in 1917. She was born in Topeka, Kansas. And she moves with her family to Chicago when she's earlier, I think it's early in her early teens. And she's published her first poem in the Chicago Defender by the age of 17. So she's very young when she begins writing publicly. And her family moves to Chicago in what is called as part of what's called the Great Migration. And it takes place, basically it's bracketed by both of the world wars. And what the Great Migration is, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is the flux of migrants, namely black migrants from the rural South into the urban North. Because they can find jobs there, they can escape Jim Crow restrictions. And her family is a part of that. But what they find when they move to Chicago, namely, and this is similar in other urban areas, but it's so distinct in Chicago, is that what the Jim Crow that they thought they were escaping in the South, they find remnants of in Chicago. And Chicago itself, because of the great number of black families that are migrating into Chicago, starts to become segregated into the South Side. And basically the only place within the city where black people are allowed to rent rooms is in this very densely packed neighborhood in which rates are exorbitant, or rent rates are exorbitantly high. It's really exploitative. And on top of that, you've got families living in very, very, very confined spaces. Yeah.
Sorry, would the dates on here be on the final or are these just like background?
I'm not writing the final, but these are important dates in terms of a historic context and in context for the lecture. So I think it's a good idea to keep notes. I think the distinctive dates to remember are when the Great Migration occurs, and the landmark publications for these women. So yeah, to be perfectly honest, I'm not writing the final, and I don't know what she's going to include on it. So in 1917, she's born in Topeka. She moves to Chicago. In 1945, her first collection comes out, A Street in Bronzeville. A Street in Bronzeville represents the living conditions of black workers and black families in South Chicago. A Street in Bronzeville, which is published and which is received really well, is criticized by Richard Wright. And we talked about Richard Wright in terms of the story that we read in here. Richard Wright is, when he writes Native Son, he's a very prominent black writer. He's the first professional black writer in American literature, and he very much, in a sense, becomes the censor or this gatekeeper of what black writing should or should not be. He also publishes an essay called Blueprint of Negro Writing, in which he's very critical of Zora Neale Hurston. We didn't talk about this in the lecture on Tuesday, but it is important to know that his criticisms of Zora Neale Hurston were very much taken to heart, so that by the end of her career, she basically dies penniless and her books have gone out of print. She doesn't become popular again until Alice Walker in the 1960s. There becomes this resurgence or resurrection of the women writers of the Harlem Renaissance. And that's because Wright, among others, but Wright is a very prominent figure at this point, he's very much censoring what Negro writing, what black writing should be. And so the poem Mother that you read, he asked her, he said, do not write this, or do not publish this. We aren't ready for this yet. The world doesn't need to see this poem yet. And that's important to note because while he asks her, but she goes ahead and publishes it, and A Street in Bronzeville is successful, many other women writers and many other black writers, period, male or female, didn't receive the same generosity or kindness because he was so critical of them. And another thing to note is that in 1947, he moves to Paris. Publishing companies are floating manuscripts back and forth to him in Paris, asking, should this represent black life in America? So the context of 1945, at this point, she's already starting to kind of step outside of the bounds of something that is very much the blueprint, that essay, Blueprint for Negro Writing, which Richard Wright wrote. In 1949, she publishes the collection Annie Allen, and it wins the Pulitzer Prize, and she becomes the first black woman to win the Pulitzer Prize. Annie Allen contains a lot of modernist and classical roots and heritage forms. Namely, there's the poem The Aeneid, which is a play on the Aeneid. So she definitely starts to engage T.S. Eliot, starts to engage modernist work as kind of this heritage of hers. She takes it on and she plays with these classical forms and stories that have been handed down to literature. but it's very Eurocentric. It's very white Eurocentric. It's very male-centric. In 1953, she publishes her first and only novel or novella, Montmartre. Has anyone ever read the book House on Mango Street? So this is written very similarly, or I guess you could say House on Mango Street is written very similar to this form of novella, in that you get vignettes or scenes. You don't get a fluid and straight narrative, right? You get small vignettes of this woman's life in Chicago. And Montmartre is important because it expresses what comes to be known as passive resistance, and it's this passive resistance that builds into the civil rights movement, into a strong and tumultuous nonviolent resistance movement, right? But what she's capturing in Montmartre is kind of what's boiling beneath the surface of the tension of race relations in South Chicago. And then 1967, she goes down to Fisk University, which is in Tennessee. It's a historically black college. And she attends a workshop of black writers where she meets Amiri Baraka and becomes involved in the black arts movement. And this becomes a very, very significant shift. This is the point where historians point and say this is where her work changes. And so the work that we have reading, we have Kitchenette, the poem The Kitchenette Song, and then we have Mother. Those are her earlier works. Those are the 1940s when she's still very much within modernism. By the time you have Malcolm X and We Real Cool, that is after this conference. And that's where we really do see a shift. And a good way to summarize that shift is that she no longer tries to engage a white audience with the underlying argument, this is what black life is like. She says, you know what, forget it. Basically, in the school of Amiri Baraka, she says it's time that we write black literature for a black audience. And it becomes very meaningful in how she writes, and that's where we see her shift in style. And in 1968, she publishes In the Mecca. And again, it has this, it's about black life for black readers. And yes, it is very significant to white readers as well, to American literature, but her intention and her impetus in writing is that I'm going to write black literature for black people. And along with Amiri Baraka and others who join into the black arts movement, that becomes a driving point of the civil rights movement. That's kind of what distinguishes the style and the shift in style from what she was writing earlier. So again, this is a little bit of historical context, and it kind of overlaps with what I've just said, but these are the important historic dates. The Great Migration occurred during 1915 to 1970, thereabouts. And like I said, it's mostly understood as rural black families moving to urban north locations. There's also heavy migration west as well. But for the sake of the literature that we're looking at, what we're most concerned with is this rural south to urban north migration. The Great Depression occurs during 1929 to 1940. And for this context, the reason why it's so important is because a lot of the privately funded literary journals and publishing houses start to collapse. And we see a shift into the university and college-run journals, like the Kenyon Review that's just north of here, run out of Kenyon College, is one of the oldest college-run literary journals. This is important because it essentially becomes, we're breaking down a class barrier, right? We're no longer, the people who are publishing work are no longer only publishing work of white upper middle class males, because the people publishing the work are not just white upper class males, upper middle class. And that's really important to see because these journals are being run out of universities, we start to see a lot more voices engaged and published. And in 1940, we have the publication of Native Son, which is 5 years prior to A Street in Bronzeville. And like I said, Richard Wright, because he is the first professional black writer, i.e. he made his living as a writer, and Native Son is received so well. Every text that follows, well into the 60s, into the 70s, is bounced off of him and off of Native Son as a work. So everything's kind of hanging in the shadow of that work. And so we also have, like I said, the Harlem Renaissance is still, its influence is carrying through. This is a quote by Langston Hughes. Again, kind of this idea of defining Black literature within American literature and what it should be. But this is the role of this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art. To be as little Negro and as much American as possible. And so again, that kind of represents the shadow that a lot of Black writers are having to fight against, essentially, that idea that they shouldn't have to write as Black writers who can write white art. They should be allowed to write Black art. They should be allowed to write from their perspectives and their experiences and not have to worry about, is it going to be well received, easily stomached by the audience. And then, of course, we have World War II taking place during 1939 to 1945. It's industrializing us even further. It's drawing us out of the Great Depression economically. So there's a lot of industry, a lot of jobs, and that continues to fuel the Great Migration, the idea that Black families can leave the South, go north, find jobs, escape Jim Crow, but it's happening in such great numbers, and it's still so exploitative that they're being confined to very, very small spaces, and paying very, very ghastly rents for these spaces. So now I'm going to jump to Adrienne Rich. And like I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of context of each of these writers, and then we're going to move into looking at their work and ways in which they engage one another, ways in which they engage what's going on in modernism, and ways they kind of answer back. So let's move in pretty quickly here. So Adrienne Rich is born 1929. Can you see that in the back? No. Zoom in right here. Is that better? So 1929, she's born in Baltimore, Maryland, to a middle-class family. In 1950, she attends Radcliffe College. At this time, Radcliffe College is a women's college, and it's closely associated with Harvard. Kind of the running mantra is that you go to Radcliffe to marry a Harvard man. In the 50s, these women's colleges in New England and the East Coast are very conservative and very privileged. In a sense, it's the best education that a woman can get, but at the same time, they're required among their materials, among their books, they're also required to bring tea sets. So that's amongst their classroom supplies and college material. And so that just gives you a little bit of an idea that the idea that the most prominent educational institutions are teaching etiquette classes and tea parties. In 1951, she publishes her first collection, A Change of World, and it wins the Yale Younger Poets Award. It was chosen by Yeats. Yeats was the judge. He chose this manuscript, and he describes these poems, and he, without even realizing how essentially condescending he's being, he's upholding this as a compliment. He says that these poems are neat and modestly dressed, speak quietly, and respect their elders. And what he says about these poems, you can read into to say this is what Rich is supposed to do. And this is why she's being upheld as an esteemed female writer, is because she behaves in her poetry the same way she's expected as a woman of the 1950s to behave. In 1953, she marries Alfred Conrad, a Harvard economist. And in 1963, she publishes Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law. And this is, so we're starting to see her shifts here. She publishes this collection, and it reflects a move away from what she describes as the disenchanted formalist to the doyen of a new women's literature. And what's distinct about that word, that phrase doyen, is that it's not necessarily, the meaning of it means that she's the best of the female writers. So it's not that she's a good writer. She has to be, in order to be worthy of her writing career, she has to be the best woman writer. And so this starts to pit her against her competition. Her competition isn't Yeats. Her competition isn't Stevens or any male publishing at this time. It's other women publishing. And this is very distinct because that starts to build a certain tone. And the way that we see that in Plath's career, we start to see how destructive it is. That idea that men are giving women their arena and saying as long as they stay within that and are neatly dressed and well behaved, one of them can come out of it. as the dawn of a new women's literature. So in 1970, she's estranged from her husband who commits suicide. And at that point, Rich, I don't know, I'm going to kind of correct what I have up there. I don't know for sure that she came out as a lesbian openly. I don't know that she publicly announced that she was lesbian, but she did move in with her lover at that time. She had a girlfriend, and they moved in, and they stayed together, namely for the rest of their lives. In 1973, she writes Diving into the Wreck. This engages the Vietnam War through what Rich herself says, the personal as political. That to speak of a personal experience is to place it within its political discourse. And as a mother and as a feminist, she cannot help but write from her personal experience, and it speak to feminism, and it speak to her resistance to the Vietnam War. So that phrase, personal as political, is very distinct in Adrienne Rich's approach to writing. And it will kind of counter what we see in Plath with confessionalism. A little bit. There's some overlap, but there's still some kind of distinctions to be made as well. And so Diving into the Wreck wins the National Book Award. In 1980, she publishes Compulsory Heterosexuality in the Lesbian Experience, and it marks the end of what is called sisterhood feminism. So what I have this up here that's important is that she writes the text that ends what we know now as sisterhood feminism. And it's in quotes, it's not necessarily, it's kind of deemed, it's kind of a condescending term in a sense, it's not a good thing. And the reason being is that during the second wave feminist movement, there becomes this rallying cry in which women feel the need to unite under their demands in order to make progress. When she writes when she writes Compulsory Heterosexuality, what that says for the first time is that women's demands are not unified, but they still have the right to make those demands, essentially. And so that's really meaningful because for the first time, it kind of fractures and severs the second wave feminist movement and says that a woman of a certain race or sexuality or class does not necessarily share all the same demands as a white middle class woman, heterosexual woman. And it's okay to have that fracture, to have that division, because the more demands we can make, the more voices we can hear, the stronger that feminist movement will be. Whereas before, the response was, we need to have one demand, we need to stay unified, and that's what will make feminism stronger. So does that make sense why there's this distinction in sisterhood feminism is kind of the myth that all women want one thing, and they share in that. And when this is published, it makes room for women of color, women of different sexualities, women of different classes, to move in and express their voices and their demands. And it doesn't necessarily have to weaken anyone else's. And then in 2007, Telephone Ringing in the Labyrinth is published. And in this, she writes that this is the undoing of her own uncertainty. And it kind of goes to show that even in 2007, even late in her life, she's writing in flux. She's writing very much not landed on what writing has to be, which is very different from, say, Richard Wright, who writes very early on in his career, Blueprint of Negro Writing, and says this is what writing has to do, and holds to it, and holds other artists to it as well. Are there any questions about that so far? So we are moving pretty quickly through these, but we're going to come back around to the work itself, and that'll kind of solidify it. So moving into Sylvia Plath. So she was very young. She was a contemporary of Rich and also of Anne Sexton. The essay that you read by Rich that was written in memoriam of Anne Sexton speaks very much to how Rich felt about Plath as well. Can you see those dates in the back? Okay. So in 1953, while she's a college student at Smith, again, Smith is very in the same class as Radcliffe. It's a very conservative, but very privileged and very prominent women's college. In 1953, she attempts her first suicide. That comes back later when we start to talk about the feminine mystique and the importance of that, because she's very much an extreme example of something that's prominent and kind of boiling under the surface here. And it's at a very young age. In 1955, she wins a Fulbright scholarship to study at Cambridge, and she goes to England. And that's where she meets her husband, Ted Hughes. They marry in 1956, and she describes in her journals, he's also a poet, so they're very much, she feels in competition with him. And the second they get married, essentially she feels all of the leverage, all of the momentum that she was gaining in her career has come to a standstill, because now she is the wife. She's no longer a poet in her own right, she's the wife of the poet Ted Hughes. And she describes in her journals her marriage as a terrible nunnery and her role as a wife as accessory to Hughes. In 1959, back in America, she joins Robert Lowell's, and Hughes is with her at this point too. She joins Robert Lowell's poetry workshop with Anne Sexton. And so this is where we start to get into the confessionalist style. They're drawing very heavily on psychoanalysis at this point, and this idea that writing, much like our dreams, basically confessionalism takes writing and says what you dream and what you desire gives us access to your subconscious or your unconscious the same way that your dreams do. And so there's this idea of trying to get deeper and deeper and deeper into yourself through writing, and that idea of kind of an internal digging is what's most important, because once that is purged, once that's brought to the surface and purged, then we can start to make sense of it. And we see that in Sylvia Plath's style, right? We see this let's get deeper and deeper and deeper into this anger or rage, this sentiment. And then once it's out, then we'll start making sense of it. And it's very difficult to do, but that's very much the confessional style. So in 1960, she publishes, I think that this is her first complete collection, The Colossus and Other Poems. In 1963, in England, she publishes The Bell Jar, and it's under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas. The Bell Jar, which is her only and very popular novel, it's taught in a lot of high school curriculums, actually wasn't published in the U.S. until after her death. On the 11th of February 1963, she commits suicide after she had been separated from Ted Hughes for 5 months. They were technically still married, which, if in the history of her work, comes to be very controversial, because she did not want The Bell Jar to be released, ever published in the U.S. Ted Hughes decides, and this is, there's some wiggle room here. Ted Hughes decides he wants to buy a house and can use those royalties, and he allows for it to be published in 1971. And it coincides with the purchase of a house. In 1981, a complete collection of her poems is published posthumously, and it wins the Pulitzer Prize. Oh, and I skipped 1965. Ariel is her second collection of poems. Again, it's published after her suicide. It's edited by Ted Hughes. He makes omissions. He takes some of her poems out. He burns her journals. So we've got kind of this censorship of how do we keep her neatly dressed and well-behaved. The same that we saw with Adrienne Rich, and the same that we see with Gwendolyn Brooks. So he is in charge of her manuscript, and he publishes it. Later there will be another, a restored edition published, but again the journals are already burned. Her final journals are already burned, and we've lost those poems that he took out. So here's a little bit of a historical context. This does overlap with Adrienne Rich. Like I said, they were kind of colleagues. They lived within very much similar circles, so I included these together. So in 1900, we see the rise of Freudian psychoanalysis with the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams. Robert Lowell, who she was in that workshop with, ascribed very much to psychoanalysis, and that starts to build into the confessionalist school. Because again, like with dream work, that idea of you don't have to necessarily make sense of what you're feeling, you just have to dig deeper and deeper into it. Once it's on the page, then we'll start to analyze it, and that kind of starts to shape the confessionalist school. And in 1963, the same year as Sylvia Sylvia Plath's suicide is the publication of The Feminine Mystique. And this book is this is a landmark text that marks the beginning of the second wave feminist movement. We're going to go into that a little bit further here. It's written by Bevy Friedan, and it started when she was asked to interview her former Smith classmates for their 15th year reunion. Sylvia Plath was attending Smith College in 1953 when she attempted suicide for the first time. So essentially, even though this starts to be written later after her death, she's still very much, she had been a part of this culture that Friedan is exploring. So it starts with, she's asked to interview her fellow alumni 15 years after they've graduated, and she starts to discover nobody's happy. And not just not happy, but absolutely miserable. And we're supposed to be the ones who, because Smith is very esteemed, who essentially have it all. So if we're the ones who have it all and we're so miserable, there's something going on here. So the feminine mystique, she creates this term, the feminine mystique, and it describes the idea that women, including these Smith, especially these Smith women, are supposed to be naturally fulfilled by devoting their lives to housewives and mothers. She shows in her text that women in the 1950s were spending more hours a day on housekeeping than women in the 1930s, despite the fact that they had spent 7 times as much of their household income, or the household income altogether, on housekeeping appliances. So all of these things that are supposed to be freeing her from her housework, there's something going on that's keeping her basically tied down to it, right? And what's going on is cultural. The feminine mystique also looks at representations of women in the media. So does anybody watch the show Mad Men? That's essentially, I mean, I know that's kind of a glorified representation, but that's exactly what Friedan is looking to, is how marketing and advertising is projecting and promoting this feminine mystique, that this is what makes women happy. Because if it is what makes women happy, why are so many of her colleagues so miserable? Okay, and so finally do you want to go back?
Yeah.
So keeping in mind, even though this does come later, the same year as Sylvia Plath's death, she's writing and she's focusing on the era in which Sylvia Plath was living and in which she attempts her first suicide. And like I said, Plath was a very extreme and unbalanced, but there's still something going on in the zeitgeist, or there's something boiling under the surface, right? So that what she's feeling, other people are expressing in more muted and balanced ways. Are we good on that?
No.
Did I hear a no?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Does anybody have any questions this far? So now we're going to jump into Ursula K. Le Guin. Ursula K. Le Guin is born around the same time, but she is born on the opposite coast. I really do think that there's some significance in that. She's quite outside of this very conservative East Coast women's college circle. But she's born in 1929, and her parents are anthropologists, and her mother is a writer who published a book. It's called Ishi, and it's about Native American culture on the West Coast. In 1953, she marries Charles A. Le Guin in Paris, and they move to Portland, Oregon. In 1966, she begins writing and publishing short stories. These are published. These are received prominently within sci-fi fantasy circles, literary circles. In 1969, she publishes the novel Left Hand of Darkness, and this becomes essentially one of the first crossover pieces in which she's written a sci-fi fantasy. Some people call it soft sci-fi, but it really does, it's received very strongly in literary circles and is upheld as literary science fiction. And what's important about this is it draws upon our perceptions of gender and sexuality as natural, innate, or fixed for the first time. That idea, the left-handed darkness, she takes, it's about a planet of humans, like remote, that had colonized far from Earth long ago. There's a separation in the human species, right? And they evolved separately for millennia. And so when these humans again come back and interact with one another, the remote colony had evolved differently, and their sexualities reflect this. And so it's that idea that we've got two different things going on. We've got the crossover of science fiction fantasy into a literary circle. In terms of a movement from modernism to postmodernism, this is showing that what we consider literary in terms of the perceptions and the voices that are being expressed, but also the genres in which they choose to express them, we're starting to break down barriers in terms of what we see as literary. And so the fact that she can bring, that her science fiction novel can be brought into a literary circle is very meaningful, because we're starting to blur genre lines that said no, literature prior to this had said no, literature does not include science fiction and fantasy. And so by the time we have in 1985, she unnames them. The story that you read for this class is published in the New Yorker. Again, this starts to show crossover, that we're starting to draw in even more perceptions and even more genres, and get less rigid about what it is that defines American literature. And in 1997, she's a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize for Unlocking Air and Other Stories. She does not win. Prior to this, she has won lots and lots and lots of science fiction fantasy awards. But this is the closest that she gets to a mainstream literary prize. And it's in 1997. So again, she's definitely distinct, set apart from the three poets that we have. But this imaginary work, the science fiction fantasy, the fact that she's writing in 1969 and it's well received, we're still seeing a struggle and a flux of trying to break down genre lines in terms of what can or should be deemed literary. Are there any questions so far?
About 11 o'clock.
Okay. So what I want to do now is we're going to move into literary techniques and approaches of each of these distinct works. But let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. And then when you come back, we'll be diving into the texts themselves. Okay?
Melissa, you got a good luck text from your mom.
I want to prop that up on something. It may work better.
I tried that and it just kept falling over. It fell over about 3 or 4 times right at the beginning, so you got some good shots at the ceiling.
I liked it whenever she'd walk out of frame, you would slightly try to view it so she would stay in it, but then right when you moved it, she would move over and you have to move it again.
Okay. It's just Dr. Thompson wants to review it.
I think that's not entirely true. I think she really wants to see it, see how she does.
Is there going to go back to the Sylvia class?
To the historical or the biographer. Thank you. Right, I don't.
I was thinking earlier. So like now. Can you explain more about second wave feminism?
You gotta ask me a more specific question than that.
Well, I mean the feminism. Like, what was the main concern of second wave feminism? Because you said the feminine mystique sparked that.
Right.
So was it about women, not being
It's
housewives?
what defines fulfillment. It's kind of this like the idea of having the right to the pursuit of happiness for women also involves a career.
Okay.
and access to education and access to professional employment that men have.